Imagine a place where the river bends like a noose around stone, where 3 meters of limestone, thick enough to bury a house, sweat moisture that never dries, where the silence has weight, where darkness has been professionally installed. This is Warwick Castle, but not the Warwick Castle they show you on postcards. In 1068, William the Conqueror planted a wooden peg in English soil and called it authority. By the 14th century, that peg had become 40 meters of vertical threat, Caesar's Tower, built with a secret. The luxury suites above housed kings. The chambers below housed something else entirely, a small grated pit barely large enough for a man to stand, an oubliette, a place designed to make people disappear while keeping them alive. Here's what they don't tell you about medieval justice. It wasn't about punishment. It was about storage, human storage. Warwick became a place where people were held not for what they'd done, but for what they were worth. Traders, merchants, travelers, anyone with money became inventory in a ransom economy that turned captivity into commerce. The trapdoor didn't slam shut. It closed with the soft finality of a business transaction. But here's the impossible part. That trapdoor still opens today. Same mechanism, same space below. The only difference? Now people pay to fall through it. The oubliette's original purpose was to make someone disappear. The modern purpose is to make that disappearance a ticketed experience. Today, we're opening the files on Britain's most efficient machine, a castle that learned to survive by serving whoever needs what it provides, whether that's containment or entertainment, whether you're a prisoner or a tourist, whether you fall through that trapdoor in 1651 or in 2024. Some buildings are haunted by ghosts. Warwick Castle is haunted by something worse, its own competence. Join us as we follow the money, trace the bodies, and discover why some machines are built too well to ever really stop working. There are rivers that meander, and then there are rivers that choose violence. The river Avon doesn't simply flow past Warwick. It curls around it, wraps itself around stone like a pre-built moat, like nature conspiring with human ambition. Stand on the banks today and you can see it. Water as accomplice, erosion as architect. This isn't accident, this is selection. This is geography making suggestions that certain kinds of minds find irresistible. The bend in the river matters more than you might think. When water curves this dramatically, it doesn't just change direction, it changes everything around it, everything that follows it, everything that tries to cross it. The outside bank erodes faster, cutting deeper into the earth with every flood season, creating a natural drop that no engineer needs to calculate and no attacker can easily climb. The physics are simple and brutal: fast water on the outside, slow water on the inside, land being stolen grain by grain from one side and deposited on the other. The inside curve fills with sediment, building up land that feels solid until you realize it's mostly compressed time, centuries of soil and stone and the remains of things the river has consumed upstream, all of it pressed together into something that looks like foundation but behaves like memory. And in the low places where the water pools during floods and retreats during dry seasons, where wet air settles and stays, trapped between stone and water and the peculiar microclimate that forms where rivers double back on themselves, moisture becomes the dungeon's quietest collaborator. This moisture doesn't just make things damp, it makes them cold. It makes them echo differently. It makes them rot in ways that dry air would never permit. It seeps into mortar and stays there, expanding when it freezes, contracting when it thaws, working like a patient stonemason to slowly disassemble whatever humans have built. It breeds things that shouldn't exist in darkness: mold that eats stone, fungi that digest lime mortar, bacteria that turns breathable air into something thicker and more hostile. This is where they chose to build, not on a mountain where visibility would be absolute, but logistics would be impossible. Not on a plain where armies could approach from any direction with equal ease. On a meander that understood power before humans invented the word. On a piece of geography that was already doing half the work of a fortress before the first stone was laid. The site offers natural advantages that would take centuries to engineer artificially. Water protection on three sides, elevation that provides sight lines without requiring the construction of artificial hills, soil composition that supports heavy stonework without shifting or settling, access to river transport for moving materials that would break the backs of pack animals on overland routes, and most importantly, control of the crossing, the single point where anyone traveling from the Welsh borders toward London would have to ask permission to continue their journey. The fortress begins as a geometry problem. Control the river crossing, and you control movement. Control movement, and you control everything that follows from movement: trade, communication, military strategy, the flow of information and influence and wealth. From this single point on the map, you can see anyone coming from three directions and watch them make the calculation. Attempt to cross here where you'll be observed and potentially stopped, or detour for miles in either direction, adding days to the journey and advertising your anxiety to everyone you encounter along the alternate routes. Choke points, sight lines, fields of fire. The mathematics of dominance that turned geography into policy. The early builders understood something that would echo through 9 centuries of English power. A castle isn't built to be pretty. It's built to make choices for other people, to create a situation where your decisions become their reality, where your convenience becomes their constraint, where your security requires their submission. Position is everything. The castle doesn't need to win every fight. It just needs to make fighting expensive enough that submission becomes the more attractive option. It needs to create a landscape where resistance costs more than cooperation, where defiance becomes economically irrational. The building itself becomes an argument, delivered in stone and mortar, and the simple fact of visibility from a distance that allows travelers to make intelligent choices about how much trouble they're willing to cause for themselves. But the camera holds on the river, watching it curve and pool and carve and fill, watching the water negotiate with stone in a conversation that's been continuing for centuries. The river is patient. Stone pretends to permanence, but water always wins eventually, given enough time. And time is what rivers have in abundance. The camera tilts down, because Warwick's most important expansions weren't upward, reaching toward sky and sunlight and the approval of God and neighbors. They went below, into darkness designed to last, into the places where rivers teach stones how to weep, where moisture meets human architecture and shows it who's really in charge, where the natural dampness that makes the location so strategically valuable becomes something else entirely when applied to the problem of storing humans for extended periods. 10/68. A date that sounds distant until you realize what it means. The conquest is 2 years old. Norman control is new enough that it still requires daily proof, recent enough that English resistance hasn't yet learned to accommodate itself to permanent foreign oversight. This is the year William the Conqueror plants a wooden peg in English ground and calls it authority. Not stone yet. Wood. Fast-build conquest architecture designed to frighten a region into submission before anyone has time to organize effective resistance. The Mott and Bailey system is military efficiency disguised as a castle, conquest disguised as construction. The process is standardized, portable, repeatable. Dig a circular ditch. Use the excavated earth to build an artificial hill, the motte. Plant a wooden tower on top of the mound. Surround the whole arrangement with a wooden fence, the bailey. Populate it with soldiers who understand that their job isn't to be comfortable, isn't to integrate with local society, isn't to make friends or learn the language or develop appreciation for English customs. Their job is to be visible, to be a reminder that the landscape has changed ownership and will remember who owns it now. Construction logistics in 1068 aren't about beauty or permanence or creating something worthy of admiration. They're about speed and discipline, and the kind of precision that turns a Norman work crew into an extension of the invasion itself. Timber needs cutting according to specifications that allow pieces to fit together quickly without excessive customization. Earth needs moving in quantities that require organization, supervision, the ability to keep workers focused on repetitive physical labor day after day. Labor needs coordinating with the kind of efficiency that treats human effort as just another resource to be allocated optimally. You build authority quickly when you can't yet afford stone permanence. When the political situation is too unstable to justify the expense of materials that take years to quarry and transport and assemble. When your hold on power is secure enough to start construction projects, but not secure enough to assume you'll be allowed to finish them. Wood allows you to establish presence rapidly, to create visible proof of control, to make people understand that resistance is now more expensive than compliance, while keeping your options open in case strategic retreat becomes necessary. But understand, Warwick's purpose isn't romantic. It isn't about knights and chivalry and the noble art of war. It's administrative. It's about bureaucracy backed by force, about making the machinery of occupation work efficiently enough to sustain itself. Control the center of England and you control the movement corridors around it. Every merchant route, every messenger path, every army trying to cross from north to south or east to west, every flow of information, wealth, influence, authority that makes governance possible. Power in 1068 is traffic management. It's making the map work for you instead of against you, making geography into an ally instead of an obstacle. It's about understanding that people and goods and messages move in predictable patterns, and that those patterns can be interrupted, redirected, taxed, monitored, controlled by anyone with sufficient understanding of the landscape and sufficient force to make their understanding stick. The wooden castle does its job. It glares down from its artificial hill and reminds everyone within a day's ride that Norman efficiency has arrived and is settling in permanently. It processes submission. It converts resistance into cooperation through the simple mechanism of making cooperation visibly more profitable than resistance. It teaches the landscape new rules. You can still travel, but now travel requires permission. You can still trade, but trade now includes a tax. You can still communicate with people in distant places, but communication now passes through filters that decide what messages deserve to reach their destinations. But wood rots. Wood burns. Wood can be chopped down by anyone with sufficient axes and sufficient motivation. Wood advertises its own impermanence. Politics outlasts wood, and sometime in the century following 1068, Warwick's owners make a decision that commits them to forever. They decide to rebuild in stone. When wood admits defeat, stone takes over like a new species, colonizing the same ecological niche. The 12th century rebuild is more than construction. It's transformation, evolution, the replacement of one kind of power with another kind of power that operates by different rules and makes different promises. Warwick stops being a camp and becomes a machine. Heavy masonry that changes what force even means, what permanence means, what resistance means, what submission means. Where wooden walls might bend under pressure or burn during sieges or be replaced when they rot, stone walls make different promises. Stone walls say, "We're not temporary. We're not experimental. We're not going anywhere. We're not here to negotiate. We are here to outlast your grandchildren and their grandchildren and everyone who comes after them. We are here to be the landscape's new memory, to teach the ground new habits that will persist until the geology itself changes." The reality of stonework is immediate and brutal and expensive in ways that wooden construction never was. Quarrying stone means finding the right kind of rock. Limestone that cuts cleanly, sandstone that weathers predictably, granite that bears weight without cracking, and then extracting it from the ground in blocks large enough to be useful, small enough to be moved. The quarrying itself requires tools, expertise, workers who understand how stone breaks, how it wants to split, how it fights back when you try to force it into shapes it doesn't want to assume. Cutting blocks means measuring precisely enough that pieces fit together without excessive gaps that would weaken the structure. It means understanding which faces need to be smooth, which edges need to be square, how much variation the mortar can accommodate before the wall starts to fail. It means organizing work crews that can maintain consistent standards across months or years of repetitive labor. It means supervision, quality control, the ability to identify and correct mistakes before they become incorporated into permanent architecture. Moving mass from quarry to construction site becomes its own engineering project. Haul routes that can handle loaded carts pulled by teams of oxen over terrain that wasn't designed for heavy transport, roads that need to be built before the castle can be built, bridges that can bear weight that would crush a man, slopes gentle enough that loaded carts don't roll backward and kill the people pushing them. Logistics that require planning, resources, the kind of coordination that treats human labor as the most expensive component of the whole operation. Then comes lime mortar, mixed with water and aggregate, according to recipes that vary depending on local materials and seasonal weather, and the specific requirements of different parts of the structure. Mortar that cures slowly between stones like industrial glue made from burned limestone and patience, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of stonemasons who learned through trial and error what works and what doesn't. The mortar doesn't just hold stones together, it becomes the stones. It fills gaps and hardens into something that makes the wall into a single piece of manufactured geology instead of just a pile of rocks held together by friction. Weight dictates everything. Room shapes bend around the requirements of load-bearing walls that need to support not just their own mass, but the mass of everything built on top of them. Ceiling vaults arch not for beauty, but because stone can't span empty space without help, because flat ceilings in stone construction either require enormous thickness or they fall down. Doorways cut through walls become structural compromises. Each opening weakens the wall, requires additional support, limits how much additional weight the wall can bear. Windows become calculations. How much wall can you remove before the building starts to forget how to hold itself up? Each window is a hole in the wall. Each hole reduces the wall's ability to carry loads. Too many windows, and the wall becomes a series of stone posts connected by hope and mortar. Too few windows and the interior becomes too dark to use effectively. The balance requires understanding structure, knowing exactly how much support is truly necessary and how much is merely traditional. But once you go stone, you inherit stone's curse. It's expensive to fix when it fails. Repairs require the same materials, the same expertise, the same logistics that made the original construction so costly. Stone doesn't bend, it breaks. And when it breaks permanently. Wood can be patched with more wood. Stone can only be patched with more stone, and the patch is always visible, always a reminder that the structure is fallible. Stone is impossible to hide. A wooden fort can be dismantled, moved, rebuilt somewhere else if the political situation changes. Stone announces its location permanently. It commits you to defending the same piece of ground for centuries. It makes you predictable, vulnerable to anyone with enough time to plan a siege, enough resources to build siege engines, enough patience to wait for winter or drought or political crisis to make your stone fortress into a stone trap. And stone remembers every compromise, every shortcut, every moment when the builders chose expedience over engineering. Stone doesn't forget weak mortar, foundations that weren't dug deep enough, walls that weren't built thick enough. Stone doesn't forgive corners that were cut, materials that were substituted, work crews that weren't supervised carefully enough. Stone doesn't lie about what it can and cannot do. When stone fails, it fails honestly, completely, in ways that teach expensive lessons to everyone watching. The stone castle can repel raids that would overwhelm wooden palisades. It can survive fires that would consume timber fortresses in hours. It can last centuries instead of decades, can shelter generations instead of seasons. But stone castles create new problems. Stone walls hold moisture in ways that wood never did. Stone floors stay cold even in summer. Stone chambers echo in ways that amplify sound, distort voices, make whispered conversations carry farther than they should, and stone castles invite different kinds of use. A wooden fort is temporary by nature, practical by necessity, limited in its aspirations by the limitations of its materials. Stone is permanent by definition. Stone changes how you think about time, about the future, about what you can accomplish if you're willing to think in terms of centuries instead of seasons. Stone makes you think differently about the spaces you've created, about how those spaces might be used, about what functions they might serve beyond their original purposes. Stone makes you think about storage, long-term storage, storage that nobody needs to know about, spaces that don't appear on public tours, chambers that serve functions you don't discuss with visitors. Stone creates possibilities that wood never offered, the possibility of building spaces that last longer than the people who built them, spaces that can serve purposes that haven't been invented yet, spaces that can hold secrets indefinitely. A stone castle can repel raids, but can it repel human nature once you start using it as a cage? Once you realize that the same features that keep enemies out can keep other people in? Once you understand that storage space designed for grain and weapons can also store different kinds of inventory? Once the distinction between fortress and prison starts to blur in ways that make both functions more efficient. During the Hundred Years' War era, Warwick acquires new skin, like an animal, molting into something more dangerous. The town-facing side is refortified with features that serve a different function than pure defense. This isn't military necessity responding to military threat. This is intimidation theater, architecture that communicates before anyone needs to attack or defend anything. The building starts speaking a language that everyone can read, even from a distance, even in poor light, even if they can't read words written on paper. Machicolations, stone galleries that jut out from wall tops like balconies designed for unpleasant purposes, with holes in the floor for dropping unpleasant things on uninvited guests, oil that's been heated until it burns skin on contact, stones large enough to crush bones, arrows that can be aimed straight down at anyone trying to climb walls or break through gates. The machicolations serve practical functions, but their primary job is messaging. They say, "We planned for you to fail. We designed this building assuming you would try to take it by force, and we built solutions to that problem directly into the architecture. Parapets with merlons and crenellations that create a rhythm of solid stone and empty space, like the building is wearing a crown made of teeth. The merlons provide protection for defenders. The crenellations provide shooting positions that allow arrows to be fired without exposing the archers to return fire. But the visual effect is more important than the military function. The repetitive pattern of stone battlements creates an unmistakable silhouette that can be recognized and understood from miles away. This is a castle. This is a place that fights back. These features serve practical functions during actual sieges, but their primary job is preventing sieges from becoming necessary. Their advertisements, their warnings, their education delivered in limestone and mortar to anyone who might be contemplating whether resistance would be cost-effective. They say, resistance has already been calculated and accounted for. Your options have been anticipated and prepared for. The building is ready for you in ways that suggest you are not ready for the building. The river facade tells a different story. Here, defensive value is minimal. The River Avon provides natural protection that makes military architecture redundant. The water is deep enough that it can't be forded easily, fast enough that swimming across while wearing armor would be suicide, wide enough that arrows fired from the far bank can't reach the castle walls. So instead of intimidation, the riverside becomes display, a symbol of power and wealth that anyone approaching from the water can read and understand and remember. The riverside is a billboard. Architecture as advertising, wealth made visible, power converted into aesthetics. The facade facing the water says, "We have so much money, so much influence, so much security that we can afford to build beauty in places where beauty serves no military function. We can afford to waste stone on decoration. We can afford to waste labor on features that exist only to be admired. We can afford to be magnificent instead of merely functional. The townside is a threat. The riverside is a promise." Different messages for different audiences, but both messages delivered by the same building, both functions served by the same accumulation of stone and mortar and human effort stretched across centuries. The building learns to perform multiple roles simultaneously, to speak different languages to different viewers, to be threatening and welcoming and intimidating and beautiful, depending on which direction you approach from and what relationship you have with the people inside. This is when Warwick begins its transition from fortress to theater set. The building learns to perform different roles for different audiences. For merchants and visitors arriving by river, its prosperity made visible, evidence that trade and cooperation are rewarded, that the economic system works for people who work within it. For anyone approaching from the town with unauthorized intentions, its consequence made architecture, a demonstration that force will be met with superior force, that resistance will be more expensive than submission. But every billboard has a backstage. Every theater has spaces where the audience isn't supposed to go. Every symbol of power needs somewhere to put the bodies that don't fit the symbol, somewhere to conduct business that doesn't belong in the public performance, somewhere to store the contradictions that make the public performance possible. Caesar's tower rises like a finger pointing at heaven, but its foundation points somewhere else entirely. 40 meters of vertical threat, a fashionable Anglo-French statement in stone that announces Warwick's arrival as a serious player in the castle business. This isn't military necessity responding to external pressure. This is architectural ambition. This is competition conducted in limestone and labor costs. This is building a castle tall enough to be seen from distances that prove you can afford to build castles tall enough to be seen from such distances. The tower serves practical functions: observation post, final retreat in case the outer defenses are breached, secure storage for valuables that need protection from fire and theft. But the tower's primary function is symbolic. It's a monument to the idea that power should be visible, that authority should be elevated, that control should announce itself to the landscape in ways that make control obvious and unquestionable to everyone within sight. At the base, curtain walls stretch up to 3 meters thick. Mass that isn't just protection, it's policy made physical. Policy that says, we have so much stone, so much mortar, so much labor, so much time, so much money, that we can afford to build walls this thick just to prove we can. The thickness isn't purely practical. It's not entirely necessary for defense against the kinds of siege engines that existed when the walls were built. It's excessive. It's conspicuous consumption in limestone and granite, a demonstration that resources exist in quantities that make efficiency irrelevant. 3 meters of stone, 3,000 millimeters, enough thickness that arrows can't penetrate, enough mass that battering rams bounce off instead of doing damage, enough material to build several normal houses, all of it dedicated to the single purpose of making one wall thick enough to impress people who see it. The walls don't just keep enemies out, they keep secrets in. They create interior spaces that are completely isolated from the outside world, rooms where sound doesn't carry, chambers where privacy is absolute and permanent. But Caesar's tower reveals the contradiction that will define Warwick for the next 8 centuries. The same structure that houses luxury suites also houses something else. The tower's identity splits like a personality disorder expressed in architecture. Above, comfort, display, the visible proof of aristocratic success. Below, a grim basement dungeon where comfort has been surgically removed and darkness installed in its place like a deliberate medical procedure. A single structure hosting 2 different universes. One where light enters through carefully designed windows that frame pleasing views of the river and countryside. One where light becomes an accident, filtered through grating and stone until it's barely recognizable as illumination, until it serves only to make the darkness visible instead of actually relieving it. One where the floors are designed for walking, for dancing, for the kinds of human movement that express joy and social connection. One where the floor is designed to remind you that walking is a privilege that can be revoked, that movement is a freedom that exists only with permission. The tower becomes a machine for processing contradictions. Feast in the upper chambers while something very different happens below. Entertain guests who admire the view and compliment the architecture, while other guests exist in spaces where view has been eliminated as a concept, and architecture serves only to make existence as uncomfortable as possible without actually terminating it. Host conversations about power and justice and the proper ordering of society while power demonstrates itself in the basement, through methods that don't require conversation, that bypass discussion entirely and proceed directly to implementation. The camera follows a stairwell that spirals down through the tower's body, past the chambers where important people conduct important business, past the levels where light behaves normally and air circulates freely and temperature remains within ranges that humans find comfortable. The stairwell continues down, cut into stone, lit by torches that create more smoke than illumination, past the point where most visitors would expect it to end, past the basement, past the foundation, into spaces that seem designed by people who understood that down is a direction that can be explored much farther than most people realize. Down to a door that looks different from the others. Heavier, simpler, built for function instead of appearance. With colder air leaking out around its edges like winter escaping from somewhere deeper, like the building is exhaling something that has been held inside too long, something that has fermented in darkness until it has become different from normal air, thicker and more hostile and harder to breathe. The door opens, the air changes, and beyond the threshold, the castle reveals its other function, its secret purpose, its answer to the question of what you do with the people who don't fit into the story you're telling about power and justice and the proper ordering of society. The jail beneath the Great Tower is established not as an add-on or afterthought, not as a hasty solution to an unexpected problem, but as part of the tower's original purpose. The true dungeon space. Architecture planned from the beginning to serve this function, designed with the same care and precision that went into the luxury chambers above, built to the same standards of permanence and durability. Damp stone sweating moisture that never fully dries, that condenses and runs down walls in patterns that suggest the building itself is crying. Air that moves differently than air above ground, heavier and closer and thicker, air that seems to resist breathing. Sound behaves strangely down here, absorbed by walls that seem hungry for noise, muffled by dampness that turns voices into whispers and whispers into silence. The acoustics are wrong in ways that make conversation difficult and screaming pointless. Words don't carry the way they should. Echoes don't return. Sound disappears into stone like water disappearing into sand, leaving only the dripping of moisture and the sound of breathing that becomes louder and more labored as the air thickens. This is architecture designed for procedural forgetting. The dungeon exists to make people disappear not just from the outside world, but from their own understanding of what existence means. It's not just containment. It's not just punishment. It's editorial. It revises what it means to be alive, rewrites the definition of human experience, creates a new category of existence that includes breathing and heartbeat, but excludes everything else that normally makes life recognizable as life. The oubliette mechanics are simple and complete, like a machine designed to solve a single problem with perfect efficiency. Access through a ceiling opening that can be concealed when not in use. Entry through a trapdoor that can be opened and closed from above without requiring the person operating it to enter the space below. No stairs, no ramp, no ladder, no dignified method of arrival or departure. You fall in. You land on stone. You wait. You hope someone remembers where they put you and decides that retrieving you might be worthwhile at some point in the future. The architecture prevents negotiation. There's no door to knock on from the inside. No guard to reason with face to face. No window to signal through. No way to communicate with the outside world except through the hole you entered through, which may or may not be attended by someone who may or may not be interested in what you have to say, who may or may not speak the same language you speak, who may or may not be authorized to make decisions about your situation. Warwick's own material describes the oubliette as a small grated pit, barely large enough for a man to stand. Not to pace, not to stretch out fully, not to lie down comfortably, to stand. The dimensions are precise enough to prevent comfort, but not precise enough to provide the mercy of impossibility. You can survive here. That's the point. Survival, suspended indefinitely in a space designed to make you question whether survival is actually preferable to the alternative, whether continuing to exist under these conditions constitutes living, or something else entirely. The grating above provides ventilation that keeps you alive and light that keeps you conscious. Just enough air to breathe, but air that tastes wrong, feels wrong, carries smells that suggest you're not the first person to occupy this space. Just enough illumination to see where you are and understand what has happened to you, but not enough light to read or write, or engage in activities that might distract from the primary purpose of the experience, which is to focus your attention completely on your situation and its implications. The grating is engineering masquerading as mercy, efficiency disguised as kindness. It provides exactly what's necessary to sustain life and consciousness while removing everything that makes life and consciousness pleasant or meaningful or recognizable as human experience. You remain alive. You remain aware. But alive and aware of what? Aware in service of what? The grating ensures that you remain conscious enough to experience your situation fully, to understand it completely, to appreciate its implications thoroughly. A guard doesn't slam a door when your time in the outside world ends. He closes a hatch, and that single gesture, the sound of wood meeting stone above your head, the darkness settling around you like a physical substance, the silence that follows, rewrites what alive means. You're still breathing, your heart still beats, your brain still functions, but you're no longer participating in the world above. You're inventory now. You're a problem that's been solved by being relocated to a place where it can't cause additional problems. The trapdoor seals, and the architecture completes its work. You haven't been killed. You've been edited out. You haven't been destroyed. You've been placed somewhere that allows the world above to continue as if you never existed, while your existence continues in a space specifically designed to make that existence impossible to remember or describe or believe. The world above proceeds normally. Business continues. Meals are served. Conversations happen. Decisions are made. Life goes on as if the hatch had never been opened, as if the trapdoor had never been used, as if the space below contains nothing more interesting than stored grain or old weapons or forgotten furniture. The hatch closes. The tower continues above you, hosting meals and meetings and conversations about the future. But below, in the small grated pit barely large enough for a man to stand, the future has been replaced with something else entirely. Time that moves differently. Hope that operates under different rules. Life that has been redefined to mean only the mechanical continuation of breathing and heartbeat, stripped of everything else that once made life recognizable. And in that redefinition, in that careful architectural separation of existence from meaning, Warwick begins its centuries-long career as a machine for processing human beings into something smaller, quieter, more manageable than human beings are supposed to be. The tower stands above, the dungeon waits below, and between them, the trapdoor serves as the punctuation mark that ends one kind of sentence and begins another kind entirely. The hatch closes, the tower stands, the river flows, and below, in the darkness designed to last forever, the first prisoner begins the long education in what it means to be forgotten while still breathing, to be alive in ways that make death seem like a change of subject rather than an ending. The education begins with the sound of the hatch closing. It continues with the dripping of water and the sound of your own breathing becoming louder in your ears as the silence stretches longer. And it never really ends, because even if you're eventually retrieved, even if you're eventually released, the dungeon goes with you. The architecture becomes part of your memory. The darkness becomes part of how you understand light. The silence becomes part of how you hear sound. And somewhere above, in chambers filled with light and warmth and the kinds of conversations that people have when they've never fallen through trapdoors, the castle continues its other work, the public work, the visible work, the work that gets recorded in history books and celebrated in legends and admired by tourists who come to see how power used to live. But below, the other work continues too, the quiet work, the invisible work, The work that teaches stone walls how to sweat and darkness, how to have weight and silence, how to become a presence that fills space more completely than sound ever could. The work that transforms human beings into something else, something smaller, something that fits more easily into the spaces that power creates when it needs to store problems until it decides what to do with them. The hatch closes. The education begins. And Warwick Castle settles into its long career as both monument and machine, both symbol and system, both the visible proof of civilization's aspirations and the invisible infrastructure that makes those aspirations possible by removing everything that doesn't fit into the story. Power tells about itself. The river flows, the stone endures, and below, in the space where light goes to die and sound goes to be forgotten, the first lesson of the dungeon education begins. You are still alive, but alive has been redefined in ways that make the distinction between life and death seem less important than you thought it was, less clear, less meaningful, less worthy of the attention you once gave it. The hatch closes, and the castle's double life begins. Warwick becomes a place where people are held not just for justice, but for value. The transformation happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a business discovering a new revenue stream that happens to involve human inventory. Prison as an invoice system. Detention as a service that can be priced according to market conditions and the financial resources of the people being detained. The logistics of captivity require a different kind of expertise than the logistics of warfare. Identifying worth means developing systems for evaluating prisoners not just as military assets or security threats, but as financial opportunities. How much might this person's family pay for their return? How much might their political allies contribute to their release? How much value does their knowledge have, their contacts, their ability to influence others who aren't currently imprisoned? The calculation becomes complex, multifaceted, requiring intelligence about family finances, political relationships, economic connections that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that led to capture. A soldier captured in battle might be worth a standard ransom. A merchant captured while traveling might be worth substantially more, depending on what cargo they were carrying, what business relationships they were pursuing, how much their absence might disrupt trade networks that other people depend on. Restricting contact becomes part of the economics. Information scarcity increases value. If families don't know exactly where their relatives are being held, they can't easily comparison shop for better detention conditions. If prisoners can't communicate freely with the outside world, they can't coordinate their own rescue or negotiate directly for better terms. If potential rescuers don't know the precise layout of the detention facility, military rescue becomes exponentially more expensive and dangerous. The fortress quietly learns to monetize time. Every day of captivity represents another day of opportunity cost for the prisoner's family, another day when business relationships deteriorate, another day when political alliances weaken, another day when the prisoner's absence creates problems that money might solve. Time becomes a renewable resource. The fortress can manufacture time by simply maintaining current conditions indefinitely, creating more time to sell to people who want the situation to change. Delaying release serves multiple functions. It increases the total amount collected in ransom payments by extending the period during which payments can be demanded. It provides additional opportunities to extract information through interrogation that might be valuable to other parties. It creates uncertainty that makes future potential prisoners more likely to avoid situations that might result in capture. And it establishes the fortress's reputation as a place where detention is serious, permanent, not easily reversed through political pressure or military intervention. The accounts note that prisoners could include not only soldiers captured in conventional warfare, but traders, merchants, travelers, people whose only offense was being in the wrong place at the wrong time with assets valuable enough to justify the effort of capturing them. Detention as a business model, not a battlefield necessity. The fortress develops from military installation to commercial enterprise, from defensive structure to profit center. The business model is elegant in its simplicity. Capture people with money, or people whose absence will motivate others to pay money. Hold them in conditions that make their release seem preferable to continued detention. Negotiate terms that maximize revenue while minimizing the risk that non-payment will force you to follow through on implicit threats. Release them when payment is complete, but slowly enough that the experience serves as advertising to potential future involuntary customers. But the business model requires infrastructure, not just walls and locks, but systems, procedures, protocols, methods for managing inventory that happens to be human, for processing transactions that happen to involve people as currency, if captivity is commerce. Warwick needs something stronger than walls. It needs process. The entry machine reveals itself as you approach the gatehouse. Murder holes positioned directly above the path that visitors must follow. Openings in the ceiling designed to allow defenders to attack anyone below without exposing themselves to return fire. Drawbridges that can be raised to prevent access or lowered to allow it, but never something that visitors control themselves. Gates that open inward, requiring anyone entering to push against their own momentum, to slow down, to become vulnerable during the transition from outside to inside. Portcullises, vertical grills of iron that can be dropped instantly to seal passages, to trap people in spaces between barriers, to create situations where forward progress becomes impossible and retreat becomes equally impossible. The portcullis doesn't just keep people out. It creates zones where people can be held temporarily while decisions are made about what to do with them. Spaces that are neither inside nor outside, but something more ambiguous, more controlled. The architecture creates layered friction that turns movement into permission. Every threshold requires authorization. Every passage can be controlled independently. Every route from outside to inside passes through multiple checkpoints where progress can be halted, reversed, redirected according to the intentions and qualifications of the person attempting to move through the system. Medieval containment protocol understands that vertical control is more efficient than horizontal control. Choke points that force people to move single file, to expose themselves individually, to become manageable rather than remaining part of a group that might coordinate resistance. Stairs that serve dual functions. They allow movement between levels, but they also exhaust people, slow them down, force them to concentrate on physical effort rather than tactical planning. Stairs are weapons. Fatigue is part of security. A person who has climbed multiple flights of stairs carrying weapons and wearing armor is a person whose fighting effectiveness has been degraded before any actual fighting begins. A person who is tired from climbing is a person who is more likely to make mistakes, to move slowly, to become isolated from companions who might be climbing at different rates or resting at different intervals. The same architecture meant to stop an army also controls a single prisoner with terrifying efficiency. The choke points that prevent coordinated assault also prevent coordinated escape. The stairs that exhaust attacking soldiers also exhaust fleeing prisoners. The gates that control access also control egress. The fortress becomes a machine for processing people from outside to inside and then keeping them inside until someone decides they can leave. Isolate, funnel, lock. The three steps that convert a person from autonomous agent to managed inventory. Isolation removes them from support networks, from allies who might assist with escape or rescue. Funneling directs them along predetermined paths where their movement can be controlled, monitored, stopped as necessary. Locking completes the conversion from person to possession, from individual to asset, from someone who makes their own decisions to something that waits for decisions to be made about them. The last security feature isn't iron, it's distance. Downward distance into levels of the castle that exist below ground level, below the reach of sunlight, below the circulation patterns that move fresh air through the upper levels, down into spaces where air doesn't move freely, where sound doesn't carry normally, where the physics of containment change in ways that make escape not just difficult, but literally unimaginable. Distance measured in meters of stone between the prisoner and the outside world. Distance that makes rescue operations exponentially more complex because rescuers must penetrate multiple layers of defenses before even reaching the person they're trying to rescue. distance that makes communication with the outside world impossible except through channels controlled by the people doing the containing, distance that converts imprisonment from temporary inconvenience to existential condition. We drop into the jail's daily reality, and the air changes immediately, stone-sweating moisture that condenses and runs down walls in patterns that suggest the building itself has developed a circulatory system, a metabolism, a way of processing the dampness that seeps up from the ground and down from the levels above. The moisture doesn't just make surfaces wet, it makes them slippery, unpredictable, hostile to any attempt to find secure footing or handholds. Light thins as you descend, not because there are fewer sources of illumination, but because the light itself becomes different. Torches that burn cleanly in the upper levels produce more smoke than illumination down here, where the air is too thick to support proper combustion, too humid to allow flames to burn at their normal temperature. The light that does reach these depths is filtered, weakened, transformed into something that reveals just enough to make the darkness visible without actually dispelling it. Sound changes in ways that make conversation difficult and silence oppressive. Voices don't travel cleanly down here. Words become muffled, distorted, absorbed by dampness and stone in combinations that seem designed to prevent communication. Whispers disappear entirely. Shouts echo in ways that make them incomprehensible. Normal conversational volume produces sounds that seem to come from somewhere else, as if the building is intercepting and redistributing voice according to its own acoustic logic. The maintenance problems are immediate and constant. Soot from torches accumulates on walls and ceilings, creating surfaces that are both slippery and toxic, that flake off in pieces that contaminate air and water and food. Mold grows in patterns that suggest the building has developed its own ecosystem, its own biological processes that operate independently of human intention or control. Leaks develop not just from rain or groundwater, but from the condensation that forms when warm air from upper levels meets cold stone below. Water appears where it shouldn't, disappears when you try to trace its source, creates pools that reflect torchlight in ways that make distances difficult to judge and surfaces difficult to navigate safely. Rats arrive not as invaders but as colonists, establishing permanent residence in spaces that provide everything they need: darkness, moisture, organic matter to consume, hiding places that humans can't access, routes of movement that bypass human security measures entirely. The rats become unauthorized inmates that the guards can't discipline, can't control, can't remove, without dismantling the entire structure that makes the jail functional. Biology becomes an unauthorized inmate that operates according to its own rules, that ignores human authority, that transforms the carefully designed architecture of containment into something messier, more complex, more resistant to management than the original builders intended. The building develops its own agenda, its own requirements, its own methods of operation that sometimes align with human intentions and sometimes work against them in ways that make effective administration increasingly difficult. But the jail is described as being in place almost certainly as long as the great tower above it. This isn't a later addition. This isn't a modification or adaptation or afterthought. The dungeon isn't an add-on. It's part of the tower's original purpose, designed and built simultaneously with the levels above, integrated into the foundation plans, incorporated into the structural engineering from the beginning. The tower was always intended to serve dual functions. The luxury chambers above were always meant to coexist with the containment chambers below. The same foundation supports both the symbol of power and the infrastructure of power, both the public performance of authority and the private mechanics of authority, both the visible proof of success and the invisible machinery that makes success possible by removing obstacles to success. The dungeon isn't just a room, it's a system. And systems leave records, not just in official documents that might be lost or destroyed or falsified, but in the physical evidence that accumulates when human beings occupy spaces for extended periods. Wear patterns on stone floors, stains on walls that suggest repeated contact with organic matter, scratches and marks that indicate the presence of metal tools, fingernails, anything hard enough to leave permanent traces in stone. Systems also leave records in the form of modifications and repairs that become necessary when the original design proves inadequate for actual conditions. Reinforcements that suggest where the original structure was weaker than expected. Drainage systems that suggest where water accumulation became a problem that required engineering solutions. Ventilation modifications that suggest where air circulation proved insufficient for maintaining human life at the minimum acceptable levels. The records exist in the building itself, written in stone and mortar and metal, in the wear patterns and stains and modifications that accumulate when theoretical prison design meets the practical realities of containing human beings for months or years at a time. The building becomes an archive, storing information about its own use in forms that are more permanent and more difficult to falsify than written documents. The dungeon acquires a second name that reveals something about how institutional memory operates when official records are incomplete or inconvenient. Poitiers Tower, a legend recorded as existing by at least 1644, tied to prisoners captured during the Battle of Poitiers, or to ransom money collected from Poitiers prisoners, or to some other connection with the English victory at Poitiers in 1356, that makes the dungeon's function explicit rather than implicit. The name serves multiple purposes. It provides historical context that makes the dungeon's existence seem natural, inevitable, connected to legitimate military objectives rather than opportunistic commerce. It creates a narrative that explains why such facilities would be necessary, why they would be built to such specifications, why they would be maintained for centuries beyond their original military justification. But legends are how a place markets fear across generations when paperwork is inconvenient. Official records can be lost, destroyed, or simply never created in the first place. Legends persist because they serve functions that official records can't serve. They create shared understanding that doesn't require authentication, common knowledge that doesn't require documentation, fear that doesn't require proof. The legend of Poitiers Tower does work that official prison records would do less effectively. It suggests that the dungeon has historical legitimacy, that its use is connected to patriotic military objectives, that the people held there were enemies of England rather than merely people who happened to have money that other people wanted. The legend transforms kidnapping for ransom into prisoner of war detention, transforms commercial imprisonment into military necessity. A mainstream history program frames it bluntly. Deep below Caesar's Tower lies a dungeon that once held prisoners captured in England's war with France. The framing is clean, simple, historically respectable. War creates prisoners. Prisoners require containment. Dungeons provide containment. The logic is linear, unproblematic, consistent with conventional understanding of how medieval warfare operated. But the framing also reveals what happens when institutional memory becomes public relations. The complexity disappears. The ambiguity disappears. The questions about who exactly was imprisoned and why and for how long and under what conditions and with what eventual outcomes, those questions get smoothed over by the simple narrative that connects dungeons to war and war to national defense and national defense to moral legitimacy. Myth makes you look down. But when you look down, when you follow the myth to its physical location, when you examine the actual spaces where the legendary events supposedly occurred, the walls make you look closer. Because someone scratched something into them. Someone left marks that have nothing to do with official narratives or public relations or legendary explanations. Someone left evidence that the dungeon was lived in, not merely rumored. The invisible chorus appears on the walls in the form of graffiti and marks that span centuries. Evidence that accumulates grain by grain, scratch by scratch, mark by mark, each individual contribution small enough to escape notice but collectively substantial enough to constitute an archive. The walls become a library written in stone, a collection of texts produced by people who had time and motivation and nothing better to do than leave traces of their presence for anyone who might follow. The graffiti requires forensic analysis to decode. Names that might be genuine or might be false. Dates that might be accurate or might be aspirational. symbols that might have specific meaning or might simply be the product of boredom and available sharp objects. But the fact that the marks exist at all provides information that official records can't provide. Someone was here long enough to make permanent modifications to stone surfaces. Someone had access to tools capable of cutting stone. Someone was motivated to leave evidence of their presence despite the obvious risks of defacing property belonging to their captors. The forensic approach reveals technical information about the marks themselves. What tool could cut limestone cleanly enough to create legible letters? How long would it take to carve a complete name into stone using only the kinds of metal objects that prisoners might conceal from guards? How much pressure would be required? How much noise would the cutting process create? What lighting conditions would allow precise work without attracting unwanted attention? The marks suggest duration. Scratching your name into stone isn't something you do during a brief detention. It's something you do when you expect to be in the same place long enough that permanent modification of your environment seems worthwhile. When you've exhausted other ways of passing time. When you've concluded that leaving traces might be the only way to achieve any form of immortality or influence or communication with future occupants of the same space. The Civil War period graffiti is described as existing in scores across the towers, concentrated enough to suggest systematic use rather than occasional imprisonment. History written by prisoners, because no one else would write their history, because official records tend to focus on the people doing the imprisoning rather than the people being imprisoned, because institutional memory preserves the perspectives of institutions rather than the perspectives of people processed by institutions. The prisoners become historians, not by choice but by necessity. Their history consists of marks on walls, evidence of presence, proof that they existed in specific locations at specific times under specific conditions. The graffiti becomes their only reliable testimony, their only voice in the historical record, their only opportunity to speak directly to future generations without their words being filtered through the administrative perspectives of the people who held them. When a wall starts talking, when you begin to decode the marks and understand them as communications rather than random damage, you realize that the building has been collecting testimony for centuries, accumulating evidence, storing stories in stone that's more permanent than paper, more difficult to destroy than written records, more resistant to official editing than formal documents. The building becomes an archive that operates independently of human archival systems. It collects information without being asked. It preserves evidence without being instructed to do so. It maintains records that institutional memory might prefer to lose, stories that official narratives might prefer to forget, voices that administrative systems might prefer to silence. The walls are patient. They wait. They accumulate testimony until the outside world collapses, until normal record-keeping systems fail, until the institutional structures that created the need for dungeons also create the need for alternatives to official documentation. The walls wait until someone is ready to listen to what they have to say, to read what they have preserved, to understand that the marks represent communications from people who knew they might not have other opportunities to speak. And the walls are ready when that moment arrives, when political stability deteriorates enough that the distinction between legitimate authority and arbitrary force becomes unclear, when institutional structures that once seemed permanent begin to reveal their fragility. When the people who built the dungeons find themselves needing dungeons, when the systems they created to control others begin to control them. When the architecture designed to contain enemies begins to contain allies and eventually contains everyone. Warwick's control falters across changing ownership and priorities that reflect larger political instabilities. Surveys begin to describe disrepair and theft that suggest the castle is being dismantled piece by people who understand the value of its component materials better than they understand the value of its symbolic function. Lead stripped from roofs, stone removed from walls, metal fittings stolen for use elsewhere, parts described as ruinated, not destroyed by enemy action, but simply abandoned to weather and neglect and opportunistic salvage. The fortress doesn't fail dramatically. It fails through missing maintenance, through small compromises that accumulate over time until the structure can no longer perform its intended functions. One stolen sheet of lead allows water to enter spaces that were designed to remain dry. Water damages wood. Wood rot weakens structural elements. Weakened structures require more expensive repairs than regular maintenance would have cost. More expensive repairs become more attractive targets for people looking for valuable materials to steal. Systems horror operates through mundane mechanisms rather than catastrophic events. The fortress becomes vulnerable not because it's conquered by superior force, but because the systems that maintain it are disrupted by changing priorities, insufficient funding, political instability that makes long-term planning impossible. The building begins to consume itself, to cannibalize its own materials when external support becomes unreliable. Even in appeals for ownership, informal documents requesting government support for maintenance and operation, Warwick is described as unable to lodge a baron properly. The phrase is precise and devastating. The castle can no longer perform its basic function as an aristocratic residence. The prestige shell remains, impressive from a distance, recognizable as a symbol of power and authority. But the interior has been compromised to the point where it can't actually house the kinds of people it was built to house. The contradiction reveals itself in architectural terms. The walls still stand, the towers still rise, the gatehouse still controls access. But the systems that make these structures habitable, the roofing that keeps water out, the heating systems that make winter survivable, the storage systems that allow food and supplies to be maintained, these systems have deteriorated beyond repair or been stripped for salvage or simply been abandoned when maintenance costs exceeded available resources. The castle becomes a theatrical backdrop, impressive to look at but incapable of supporting the lifestyle it was designed to enable. The symbol persists while the reality deteriorates. The appearance of power continues while the infrastructure of power crumbles in ways that make actual power increasingly difficult to exercise effectively. A neglected machine is dangerous in ways that a functional machine is not. Functional machines behave predictably. Neglected machines develop unpredictable failure modes, create hazards that weren't part of their original design, become hostile to the people who try to operate them without understanding how deterioration has changed their operating characteristics. The castle becomes dangerous to its own occupants. Roofs that leak create structural damage that makes upper floors unsafe. Drainage systems that fail create flooding that makes lower levels uninhabitable. Security systems that aren't maintained create false confidence that leads to tactical mistakes. The building becomes unreliable in ways that make it worse than useless. It becomes actively threatening to the people who depend on it. And in August 1642, danger walks up to Warwick's gate with cannon behind it. The English Civil War arrives at a fortress that's no longer capable of performing the functions it was designed to perform. That's been weakened by decades of deferred maintenance and opportunistic dismantling. That's been transformed from defensive structure to symbolic structure to liability. The war finds a castle that looks like it should be able to withstand a siege, but that may no longer have the structural integrity to support the kinds of forces that sieges create. The machine is broken. The maintenance has failed, the systems are compromised, and now the test begins. Can a deteriorated fortress survive when a functional fortress would be challenged? Can symbols of power perform as well as actual power when the distinction between symbol and reality becomes literally a matter of life and death? August 1642. The date arrives like a deadline, like a test that's been postponed as long as possible but can't be postponed any longer. The castle will discover what it's actually worth when appearance stops being sufficient, when reputation becomes irrelevant, when the only thing that matters is whether the walls can actually stop the things they were built to stop. The siege approaches, the gates close, the test begins. And somewhere below, in the dungeons that have been collecting testimony for centuries, the walls prepare to witness what happens when the people who built prisons find themselves in need of prisons, when the systems designed to contain others begin to operate without regard for who controls them and who doesn't. The machine operates according to its own logic now. The walls endure. The dungeons wait. And the castle prepares to discover whether its double life, symbol and system, monument and machine, has prepared it for the moment when the outside world collapses, and the only thing that matters is what you've actually built, not what you've appeared to build. August 1642. The test begins. 7 August 1642. The knock arrives not as a polite request, but as a formal demand delivered by men who carry authority backed by cannon. A royalist force appears at Warwick's gates with the kind of confidence that comes from superior numbers, superior equipment, and the assumption that castles held by parliamentary forces will surrender rather than endure siege warfare against troops loyal to the king. The demand is simple and absolute. Surrender. Open the gates. Lower the drawbridge. Allow royal authority to reoccupy a fortress that belongs to the crown and has been illegally held by rebels who mistake parliamentary authorization for legitimate governance. The alternative is siege, bombardment, the systematic destruction of a building that has stood for centuries, that represents substantial financial investment, that serves important strategic functions regardless of which political faction controls it. The refusal is equally simple and equally absolute. The gates remain closed. The drawbridge stays up. The garrison prepares for siege warfare against an enemy that possesses advantages in numbers, equipment, and political legitimacy, but disadvantages in position, supplies, and time. The castle chooses resistance over submission, destruction over surrender, uncertain military outcome over certain political defeat. Crisis logistics reveal themselves immediately. Who's actually in command when the nominal commander might be absent, unreachable, or operating under orders that don't account for current tactical realities? How do you ration food supplies that were adequate for normal garrison operations, but inadequate for extended siege conditions? How do you maintain morale when the building you're trusting to protect you is already showing signs of structural deterioration that make its defensive capabilities questionable? The psychological pressure is immediate and constant. The garrison must function effectively while surrounded by enemies who outnumber them, while cut off from supply lines and communication networks that normally provide support, while uncertain about whether relief forces will arrive or whether political support will continue if the siege becomes expensive or embarrassing for parliamentary leadership. The building itself becomes a source of anxiety rather than confidence. Walls that leak during normal weather conditions will leak more severely during the winter months that a long siege might encompass. Roofing that's been compromised by deferred maintenance will fail completely under the stress of bombardment. Storage systems that barely function during peacetime will break down entirely under wartime pressure. But the siege is lifted 23rd August 1642. 16 days. A date range that turns Warwick into a pressure chamber where endurance is measured not in months or years, but in days that feel like months, nights that feel like years. 16 days during which the garrison learns what the castle can actually do, what its walls can actually withstand, what its systems can actually support under conditions they were designed for, but had never been required to perform under. The castle survives the siege. The walls hold. The gates remain closed under royal pressure, remain controlled by parliamentary authority. The building proves that centuries of stone and mortar and engineering can still perform their intended function, can still convert military force into political irrelevance, can still make superior numbers irrelevant when those numbers can't reach the people they're trying to control, but survival creates a new problem. The siege ends, but the war continues, and war produces prisoners, captured soldiers, political dissidents, people whose only crime is being on the wrong side when military fortune shifts, when battles are won or lost, when political control changes hands in ways that make yesterday's allies into today's enemies and today's prisoners. The castle discovers that its old talent for storage hasn't been forgotten during the decades when storage meant grain and weapons rather than human beings. The dungeons remember how to function. The cells remember how to contain. The systems that once processed French prisoners captured at Poitiers are still operational, still functional, still available for processing English prisoners captured at places with different names but similar strategic importance. The besieging army opens fire, and the sound changes everything inside the castle. Cannon fire isn't like other forms of warfare. It announces itself from miles away, gives defenders time to prepare mentally for impact, creates anticipation that becomes its own form of psychological warfare. The sound travels through stone in ways that make the entire building into a resonating chamber that amplifies and distorts the noise until it becomes impossible to identify the direction or proximity of individual shots. The cannonballs strike Warwick's walls to little effect. The impact disperses across surface area measured in square meters, rather than concentrating on impact points measured in square centimeters. The stone doesn't crack because the stone is thick enough to absorb kinetic energy and distribute it harmlessly through mass that was specifically designed for this purpose, that was built to exact specifications calculated to make bombardment ineffective. Impact dispersion operates according to physics that favor defenders who can afford to build walls thick enough to treat cannonballs as irritation rather than threat. The energy of impact spreads through stone that's been laid in patterns designed to transfer force horizontally and vertically, to share stress among multiple blocks, to prevent any single impact from compromising the structural integrity of the wall as a whole. Stone resilience reveals itself in real time. Individual blocks might crack or chip, but the wall remains functional. Surface damage accumulates without affecting load-bearing capacity. Cosmetic destruction occurs without corresponding tactical advantage for the attackers, who expend expensive ammunition to achieve results that don't advance their strategic objectives. The psychology of hearing cannon strike and watching the wall refuse to react creates different effects inside and outside the castle. For defenders, each impact that fails to breach the wall provides evidence that their trust in stone engineering is justified, that their decision to resist rather than surrender is tactically sound, that the building they're relying on for protection can actually provide protection under combat conditions. For attackers, each ineffective shot represents wasted resources, ammunition expended without corresponding tactical gain, time invested in methods that may not produce the results they expected. The walls don't just resist damage, they resist intimidation. They fail to provide the psychological warfare effects that bombardment is supposed to create in addition to the physical damage it's supposed to inflict. Warwick's defensive value isn't just weapons or garrison strength or tactical position, it's inertia. 3 meters of thickness doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise. It doesn't adapt to changing political conditions or military pressures. It simply exists, immovable and immutable, converting kinetic energy into heat and noise and fragments without allowing those forces to achieve their intended effects. The thickness represents accumulated labor, accumulated resources, accumulated time that can't be reversed or undone by any force the besiegers can bring to bear. Each stone was quarried, transported, shaped, positioned according to engineering principles that account for exactly this situation. The wall isn't just defending the castle, it's defending centuries of investment, generations of work, accumulated expertise in stonework and fortification that represents wealth and power converted into permanent form. Inertia becomes a military asset. The walls can't be reasoned with, can't be bribed, can't be convinced to change sides or abandon their posts. They don't suffer from morale problems. They don't require supplies. They don't get tired or hungry or homesick. They simply continue doing what they were built to do, regardless of political circumstances, military pressure, or changing strategic conditions. But if the walls can't be breached, the war finds another entry point. It discovers that stone fortresses designed to keep enemies out can also keep prisoners in, that defensive systems can be operated in reverse, that siege warfare creates not just military casualties, but human inventory that requires storage, processing, management, according to procedures that convert captured enemies into administrative problems that require administrative solutions. The war fills the towers from the inside, not with defenders, but with prisoners, not with people who chose to be there, but with people who have no choice about being there. The castle's dual function reveals itself again: fortress and prison, defensive position and containment facility, military installation and storage system for processing human beings who have become inconvenient for various reasons. After the Battle of Edgehill in 1642, Prisoners arrive at Warwick in quantities that require systematic processing. Caesars and Guy's towers are repurposed for containment rather than accommodation. The castle reverts to its old talent, storage. But storage of humans requires different procedures than storage of grain or weapons. Humans require food, water, sanitation, medical care. Humans can escape if security becomes inadequate. Humans can coordinate resistance if they're allowed to communicate with each other. The chain of custody microdrama begins with basic questions that don't have obvious answers. Where do you put captives who arrive in groups rather than individually? How do you separate officers from enlisted soldiers when military hierarchy needs to be preserved for prisoner exchange negotiations but dissolved for security purposes? What do you do when your guest tower, designed to house important visitors in comfort appropriate to their status, becomes a cage for housing important prisoners in conditions appropriate to their new status as property? The logistics are immediate and complex. Edgehill produces prisoners who arrive tired, hungry, wounded, demoralized, uncertain about their legal status or political future. Some expect to be exchanged promptly for parliamentary prisoners held by royalist forces. Others fear execution as traitors. Most simply want to survive captivity and return to civilian life when the war ends, whenever that might be, however that might be defined. Processing requires identification, evaluation, classification, according to criteria that determine how each prisoner will be housed, fed, guarded, eventually released or disposed of. Officers receive treatment consistent with their military rank and social status. Enlisted soldiers receive treatment consistent with their usefulness for labor projects and prisoner exchanges. Political prisoners receive treatment consistent with their perceived danger to parliamentary authority. Warwick's towers were designed for status hierarchy expressed in architectural terms. Higher floors for higher guests, better rooms for better people, more comfort for more important visitors. The vertical arrangement of space reflects social arrangements that make elevation literal and metaphorical simultaneously. Important people live above less important people, closer to heaven, farther from the ground where common people conduct common business. But the hierarchy becomes inverted when the towers serve as prison rather than accommodation. Higher floors become less secure rather than more prestigious. Easier escape routes rather than better views. Greater risk of successful rescue attempts rather than greater comfort and privacy. The most dangerous prisoners are held at ground level or below, where stone walls are thickest and escape routes are fewest. The inversion creates punishment geography that uses architecture to communicate status in reverse. Instead of elevation indicating importance, depth indicates danger. Instead of height suggesting privilege, proximity to ground level suggests security risk. The building's original social logic gets turned upside down when the building serves different functions, when guests become prisoners and accommodation becomes containment. The prisoners arrive with time on their hands. Captured soldiers have nothing to do except wait for prisoner exchanges that may never occur, for political developments that may never favor them, for military outcomes that may make their survival irrelevant to anyone who has power to decide their fate. Time becomes the medium in which imprisonment occurs, the substance that fills space between capture and release, between hope and despair, between life and whatever comes after life, when life becomes prolonged indefinitely without purpose or direction, and time always finds a way to leave a mark. Prisoners with nothing else to do begin modifying their environment in small ways that provide evidence of their presence, proof of their existence, testimony about their experience that might outlast their physical survival. The walls become writing surfaces, stone becomes paper, scratching tools become pens, and the archive grows, entry by entry, mark by mark. A garrison is maintained from 1643 to 1660 with supplies and artillery that reflect Warwick's transformation from symbolic fortress to functional military installation. At peak capacity, 302 soldiers occupy the castle. The number is precise, specific, documented in records that treat human resources like any other military asset that requires counting, inventory control, maintenance procedures that keep the asset functional under operational conditions. 302 men, each requiring food, shelter, clothing, medical care, weapons, training, supervision, payment according to terms that keep them loyal to parliamentary authority instead of royalist authority or their own authority if military discipline breaks down, each representing ongoing costs that must be justified by corresponding tactical value, strategic position, contribution to military objectives that extend beyond simply holding the castle. The invisible chorus expands beyond prisoners to include all the people necessary to make imprisonment function as an ongoing operation rather than temporary expedient. Guards who monitor prisoners and maintain security procedures that prevent escape, rescue, or internal organization that might threaten control. Quartermasters who manage supplies that keep both guards and prisoners fed, clothed, housed in conditions that sustain life without encouraging resistance. Cooks who prepare food in quantities sufficient for hundreds of people using ingredients that may be difficult to obtain when supply lines are disrupted by military action, political instability, seasonal weather that makes transportation impossible. Masons who patch damage caused by bombardment, structural failure, normal wear that accelerates under crowded conditions that push the building beyond its designed capacity. The castle develops an economy that operates according to military rather than civilian logic. Resources are allocated according to security priorities rather than market forces. Labor is organized according to command structure rather than voluntary agreements. Production focuses on maintaining operational capability rather than generating profit or improving living conditions for anyone except the people who control the operation. But the garrison also reveals how a allegedly haunted place is actually operated by receipts, by mundane administrative procedures that convert Gothic atmosphere into bureaucratic routine. Food inventories, weapon maintenance schedules, pay records, medical reports, security protocols, the countless documents that any military installation generates when it functions according to regulations designed to prevent corruption, inefficiency, breakdown of discipline that would compromise military effectiveness. The haunted castle becomes a business operated according to principles that prioritize efficiency over atmosphere, functionality over mystique, practical results over romantic mythology. The ghosts get displaced by accountants. The legends get replaced by logistics. The supernatural becomes subordinate to the bureaucratic, which may actually be more frightening than anything supernatural could manage to be. A fortress under permanent garrison becomes something worse than a prison. It becomes a military warehouse with prisoners attached. The prisoners become inventory stored in a facility designed for multiple functions, where storage of human beings competes with storage of weapons, ammunition, food, equipment necessary to maintain military readiness under siege conditions that may develop without warning. The warehouse logic treats prisoners as items rather than people, as problems requiring storage solutions rather than individuals requiring humane treatment. The goal becomes efficient management of inventory rather than justice, rehabilitation, or even punishment in any meaningful sense. Prisoners exist to be counted, fed minimally, housed securely, maintained in condition adequate for eventual exchange or disposal according to strategic considerations that may change without notice. The war drags on through years that blend together in repetitive cycles of military action, political negotiation, temporary truces that create hope for permanent peace, followed by renewed conflict that destroys hope and requires continued military preparation. 1643, 1644, 1645, 1646, 1647, 1648, 1649, 1650. Years during which the garrison remains active, the prisoners remain imprisoned, the castle remains operational as military installation and containment facility. Then 1651 arrives, bringing the final wave of bodies. The Battle of Worcester produces prisoners in numbers that strain containment systems throughout England, that require improvised solutions to storage problems that exceed the capacity of existing facilities, that force military commanders to make decisions about human inventory based on available space rather than legal procedures or humanitarian considerations. 3rd of September 1651. Worcester's shadow falls across England in the form of thousands of captured men moving through the countryside under armed guard toward prisons, temporary detention facilities, improvised containment systems that convert civilian buildings into military storage for processing human beings captured during what becomes the final major battle of the English Civil War. The timeline pressure is immediate and unforgiving. Captured men who must be moved quickly to prevent rescue attempts or coordinated escape. Roads that can't handle the volume of human transport required to relocate thousands of prisoners simultaneously. Food and water supplies that must be organized for people in motion rather than people in fixed locations. Medical care for wounded prisoners who must be kept alive long enough to be processed through systems that may not have capacity for their needs. Triage decisions become necessary when demand exceeds capacity, when the number of prisoners exceeds the available space for housing them securely. Some prisoners are released immediately because they pose minimal security risk, and their maintenance costs exceed their strategic value. Others are executed because they pose maximum security risk, and their maintenance costs would exceed available resources. Most are distributed among available facilities according to capacity and security requirements. The brutal math of where you can physically store humans becomes the determining factor in decisions that affect thousands of lives. How many people can be housed in a given space while maintaining minimal security requirements? How much food is required to keep prisoners alive but not comfortable? How many guards are necessary to prevent escape without exceeding personnel costs that make the operation financially unsustainable? Worcester is massive in scope and consequence. Thousands captured during a single military engagement that effectively ends organized royalist resistance in England. The scale makes Warwick not a singular dungeon story, but a node in a nationwide containment network that processes political prisoners on an industrial scale, that requires coordination among multiple facilities to handle human inventory that exceeds local capacity. Warwick becomes part of a system rather than an independent operation. Its dungeons contribute to national capacity for storing captured enemies rather than serving only local detention needs. The castle's resources become available to military commanders who operate according to strategic priorities that extend far beyond Warwickshire, that treat individual facilities as components in a larger machine designed to process political opposition through containment that removes enemies from active resistance while keeping them available for future exchange, execution, or release according to changing political conditions. The war ends, but the building doesn't end. The castle remains operational, while political authority transitions from parliamentary control to restored royal control, while military priorities change from defeating royalist opposition to maintaining domestic order under new political arrangements, while the legal status of prisoners changes from captured enemies to potentially pardoned subjects depending on policies that haven't been determined yet. The state faces decisions about what to do with a castle that learned to function as a prison, that developed expertise in containment operations, that represents substantial investment in infrastructure designed for storing humans under controlled conditions. The building itself argues for continued operation. The dungeons remain functional. The security systems remain effective. The personnel remain trained and experienced in procedures that few other institutions understand as well. But political priorities change when wars end. Military budgets decrease when external threats diminish. Public support for maintaining expensive containment facilities decreases when the prisoners are no longer perceived as immediate threats to national security. The castle becomes a costly asset that serves functions the government may no longer consider essential, that requires ongoing investment to maintain capabilities that may no longer be strategically valuable. In 1660, the Council of State orders the governor to disband the garrison and hand the castle over to civilian authority. Warwick's military prison phase is formally shut down by administrative order that treats the end of imprisonment as an accounting problem rather than a humanitarian issue, that focuses on cost savings rather than justice for people who have been held for years without trial or clear legal justification. The order is straightforward and absolute. Disband the garrison, terminate military operations. Transfer responsibility to civilian authorities who may or may not be interested in continuing prison operations, who may have different priorities for using the castle, who may prefer to convert the building to functions that generate revenue rather than consuming resources. What shut down means in stone becomes clear as the order is implemented. Cells are emptied not because prisoners are released, but because prisoners are transferred to other facilities, executed, or simply turned loose to survive as best they can without government support or protection. Supplies are moved to other military installations where they will support continuing operations rather than discontinued functions. Locks are left to rust because security hardware represents expense that serves no continuing purpose. The mechanisms of containment remain in place but unmaintained, available for future use if political conditions change but not actively maintained in operational condition. The dungeons don't get demolished because demolition would cost more than abandonment, because the stone and iron might be valuable for future projects, because destruction feels more deliberate than neglect. The dungeons become monuments to their own function, empty cells that preserve the shape of imprisonment without the substance. Security systems that demonstrate how containment operated without actually containing anyone. Architecture that remembers its purpose while serving no current purpose, that waits for new prisoners who may never arrive. Warwick's own dungeon record ends not with justice, but with paperwork. The last recorded use tied to the Civil War period not because the dungeons become unsuitable for imprisonment, but because imprisonment becomes unsuitable for current political priorities. The end arrives as administrative decision rather than humanitarian reform, as cost-cutting measure rather than recognition that prolonged detention without trial violates principles of justice. The paperwork that ends the dungeon era is precise and mundane. Inventory transfers, personnel reassignments, budget adjustments that eliminate line items for guard salaries, prisoner maintenance, facility security. The documents treat the end of human storage as routine administrative matter, comparable to closing any other government facility that has outlived its usefulness or exceeded its budget. The trapdoor closes for the last time as an active component of government policy. The sound is different when the closing is final rather than temporary, when the hatch seals not just another individual prisoner, but the entire system that made individual imprisonment possible. The mechanical action remains the same, but the meaning changes completely. The hatch closes, and the castle begins its next transformation. From active military prison to inactive historical curiosity, from functional containment facility to atmospheric decoration, from system that processes human beings into symbol that represents human history. The transition requires years rather than moments, decades rather than years. But it begins with the simple gesture of closing the trapdoor and walking away without planning to return. The castle enters a new phase of its existence where trauma becomes decor, where the spaces designed for suffering become spaces designed for tourism, where the machinery of imprisonment becomes the scenery of entertainment. The dungeons remain, but their function changes from containing prisoners to containing tourists who pay to experience imprisonment as historical recreation rather than political reality. The transformation isn't immediate or complete. The building retains its capacity for containment while developing new capacity for display. The walls remember how to hold prisoners while learning how to hold audiences. The dungeons continue to function as dungeons while beginning to function as theaters, where imprisonment becomes performance rather than punishment. The trapdoor closes, the garrison departs. The prisoners are transferred or released or otherwise disposed of according to procedures that treat human beings as administrative problems that require administrative solutions. And Warwick Castle begins the long process of converting its expertise in containing enemies into expertise in entertaining visitors who want to experience what containment felt like without actually being contained themselves. The building's double life continues, but the balance shifts. The symbol becomes more important than the system. The performance becomes more profitable than the reality. The decor becomes more valuable than the trauma, which doesn't disappear but becomes invisible, forgotten, treated as background detail rather than foreground experience. The castle survives by changing its relationship with imprisonment. Instead of practicing imprisonment, it displays imprisonment. Instead of containing prisoners, it contains tourists. Instead of processing human beings into something smaller, it processes historical experience into something larger, more dramatic, more entertaining than historical reality actually was. The transformation succeeds because it preserves the atmosphere while eliminating the substance, maintains the appearance while removing the function, keeps the shadows while dispelling the darkness. The dungeons become safe to visit because they're no longer dangerous to inhabit. The fear becomes enjoyable because it's no longer real. But the walls remember. The stones retain their knowledge. The architecture preserves its expertise. And somewhere in the thickness of 3-meter walls, in the dampness of cells that learn to sweat, in the silence of spaces designed to absorb sound, the castle's other life continues, waiting, ready to return to its original function if political conditions change, if new prisoners require containment, if the trapdoor needs to close again on someone who isn't there by choice. The hatch closes, the tourist season opens, and Warwick Castle begins its career as a place where people come to experience imprisonment without understanding what imprisonment actually means, to feel fear without experiencing terror, to participate in history without recognizing that history never actually ended, just changed its methods of operation. 1660. The official end. The beginning of something else entirely. The moment when the castle stops being a machine and starts being a memorial to the machine. When the dungeons stop containing prisoners and start containing memories of prisoners. When the trapdoor stops opening for real reasons and starts opening for educational ones. The transformation is complete. The castle has learned how to monetize its own history, how to profit from its own past, how to convert trauma into revenue stream that sustains the building while obscuring the experiences that made the building necessary in the first place. The machine stops. The memorial begins, and the castle enters its modern life as a place that teaches people about imprisonment while carefully avoiding teaching them too much about what imprisonment actually does to the people who experience it, without choosing to experience it, without paying for the experience, without being able to leave when the experience becomes uncomfortable. The trapdoor closes, the tour begins, and Warwick Castle becomes a monument to its own contradictions, a symbol that represents what it once was while carefully concealing what it actually did. The carpenters arrive in 1669 with blueprints for forgetting. Master craftsmen who understand their assignment, transform fortress spaces into fashionable rooms, layer comfort over old fear, convert military architecture into domestic decoration that allows people to live comfortably in spaces originally designed to make comfort impossible. Post-war modernization that treats the castle's dark history as an interior design problem that can be solved with sufficient wallpaper and furniture. The work continues through 1678. 9 years of refitting interiors according to standards that prioritize beauty over honesty, elegance over accuracy, aristocratic luxury over historical truth. Rooms that once served as interrogation chambers become drawing rooms. Spaces that once echoed with screams become spaces that echo with polite conversation. Cells that once contained prisoners become storage closets that contain linens and china and the kinds of household items that wealthy people accumulate when they have more money than they know what to do with. The carpenters work with deliberate precision to erase evidence while preserving structure. They panel over stone walls that bear scratches and stains from previous occupants. They install flooring that covers wear patterns created by people who paced endlessly in confined spaces. They create window treatments that filter light in ways that make dungeons feel like parlors, that transform spaces designed for despair into spaces designed for entertaining guests who would be horrified if they understood what they were actually seeing. But architectural irony operates according to physical laws that interior decoration can't overcome. You can wallpaper over history, but you can't relocate foundations. You can install heating systems, but you can't eliminate the dampness that seeps up from ground level and down from compromised roofing. You can paint surfaces, but the paint peels in patterns that reveal what lies beneath. You can carpet floors, but the carpet develops stains and odors that suggest something is bleeding through from below. Damp and darkness remain underneath all the cosmetic improvements. The building's structural problems become decorative problems that require ongoing maintenance, constant repair, vigilant attention to details that reveal the building's true nature despite attempts to conceal it. Wallpaper bubbles where moisture penetrates, wood warps where dampness concentrates, paint discolors where chemical processes continue in stone that has absorbed too many different kinds of organic matter over too many years. The darkness doesn't disappear when you hang tapestries. It just becomes a different kind of darkness. Spaces that once felt threatening because they were honestly threatening now feel unsettling because they're dishonestly non-threatening. The atmosphere changes but doesn't improve. Visitors sense something wrong without being able to identify what's wrong, feel uncomfortable without understanding why they feel uncomfortable, experience anxiety that seems disproportionate to their actual circumstances. Warwick hosts royal visits again, proving that institutions recover reputation faster than they recover ethics. Kings and queens who would have been horrified by the castle's function during the Civil War become comfortable visiting the castle once its function has been officially discontinued and its appearance has been officially improved. The royal presence serves as endorsement, authentication, proof that the building has been successfully rehabilitated and can now be considered appropriate for polite society. The royal visits provide legitimacy that money can't buy and history can't erase. When the monarch accepts hospitality in a former prison, the former prison becomes a former prison, a place where imprisonment once occurred but no longer occurs, a building that once served dark purposes but now serves bright purposes, architecture that once embodied oppression but now embodies hospitality and grace. But the legitimacy is performance rather than reality, surface rather than substance. The royal visits don't change what the building actually is. They just change what the building is allowed to be publicly. The dungeons remain functional. The security systems remain operational. The capacity for containment remains available if political circumstances change, if new prisoners require processing, if the performance of rehabilitation becomes inconvenient or impossible to maintain. Once a place becomes grand in official terms, the public wants access. Visitors who hear about royal visits and fashionable renovations develop curiosity about spaces that have been declared safe for royalty, appropriate for tourism, suitable for public consumption. But visitors don't just tour halls and admire tapestries and comment politely on furniture. They ask questions. They want to see everything. They want to understand how the building actually works, what its history actually involves, what spaces exist beyond the public areas. And visitors don't just tour halls. They ask what's downstairs. The question arrives inevitably, repeatedly, persistently. Guests who have been shown the beautiful rooms want to see the interesting rooms, the unusual rooms, the rooms that aren't included in standard tours because they aren't suitable for standard tourists. The dungeons become curious rather than forbidden, attractive rather than repulsive, desirable rather than avoidable. The public's curiosity creates pressure that official policy can't resist indefinitely. If people want to see the dungeons, and if the dungeons no longer serve official functions that require secrecy, and if tourism generates revenue that helps offset maintenance costs, then showing people the dungeons becomes economically rational even if it's historically uncomfortable. The building's dark spaces become potential assets rather than potential liabilities. The transformation accelerates through the 18th century, when Capability Brown arrives with plans for making the grounds look natural. Landscape architecture that creates curated softness draped over military geometry. Garden paths that wind gently around fortifications designed for maximum defensive efficiency. Lawn areas that invite picnicking in spaces originally calculated to provide clear fields of fire for archers and artillery. Brown's landscaping operates through strategic concealment rather than complete transformation. The castle's military features remain visible but become picturesque rather than threatening, decorative rather than functional, romantic rather than practical. Curtain walls become scenic backdrops for garden parties. Defensive towers become focal points for landscape photography. Murder holes become architectural curiosities that add historical interest without historical anxiety. The landscape design creates cognitive dissonance that makes the castle's dark history easier to ignore. Beautiful gardens suggest peaceful intentions, Gentle walking paths suggest leisurely contemplation rather than military strategy. Natural-looking plantings suggest harmony with nature rather than domination over human beings. The grounds become argument against the building's actual history, evidence that the castle has been domesticated, civilized, converted from instrument of oppression to symbol of cultural refinement. The contrast between above and below becomes deliberately emphasized through landscape techniques that make the surface as pleasant as possible, while leaving the depths unchanged. Visitors experience beauty and serenity, while walking over spaces designed for ugliness and terror. The garden paths lead past entrances to dungeons, but the entrances are landscaped to look decorative rather than functional, historical rather than operational, safe rather than dangerous. The sonic landscape reveals the continuing contradiction. Birds sing above ground where visitors walk through gardens designed to promote tranquility and appreciation of natural beauty. Water drips below ground where the dungeons continue their patient accumulation of moisture, their slow dissolution of mortar, their steady conversion of human engineering into geological process. The sounds exist simultaneously, life above, decay below, but the landscape design ensures that visitors hear only what they're supposed to hear. The castle's identity becomes explicitly dual use through landscape architecture that makes the duality comfortable rather than disturbing. Heritage prestige operates on the surface where tourists can see it, photograph it, discuss it in terms that connect it to broader narratives about English history, aristocratic culture, architectural achievement that represents the best aspects of human civilization. Institutional memory operates underneath where it can be forgotten, ignored, treated as irrelevant to contemporary experience. Heritage prestige focuses on aspects of the castle's history that can be celebrated rather than aspects that must be apologized for. Military victories rather than military prisoners, architectural innovation rather than architectural oppression. Royal visits rather than royal authority exercised through systematic imprisonment. Cultural achievement rather than cultural trauma. The surface narrative becomes increasingly detached from the underground reality. Tourism grows throughout the 19th century, as transportation improvements make castle visits accessible to middle-class families looking for educational entertainment that combines historical instruction with scenic beauty. But tourism brings the worst kind of threat to truth: taste. Tourist preferences begin to influence how the castle presents itself, what stories it tells, what experiences it offers to visitors who want their history to be educational but not disturbing, interesting but not traumatic. Taste operates as a form of censorship that doesn't require official policy. It simply makes certain kinds of truth economically disadvantageous. Visitors prefer stories that inspire rather than stories that horrify. They want to admire rather than to understand. They want to feel proud of their cultural heritage rather than ashamed of their cultural inheritance. Tourism creates market pressure that shapes historical narrative according to customer satisfaction rather than historical accuracy. The castle begins to edit its own story to meet tourist expectations. The dungeons become mentioned but not emphasized. The prisoners become acknowledged but not described in detail. The suffering becomes historical context rather than historical content. The castle learns to tell stories about itself that are true enough to be defensible but incomplete enough to be comfortable. 3rd December 1871, 2 Iruwansha a.m. Fire arrives like a second siege, but this enemy attacks from inside. The alarm is raised at 2 a.m. on Sunday morning when flames are discovered in the Great Hall. Not cannon fire from outside enemies trying to break in, but something more intimate, more internal, more personal than military assault. Fire that starts inside the building and spreads according to architectural logic that turns the castle's structure against itself. The Great Hall burns first, then the private apartments. Spaces that survived centuries of warfare succumb to flames that spread faster than defensive systems can respond, that consume in hours what took decades to build, that convert accumulated wealth into smoke and ash, and memories of what wealth used to look like before it became fuel for its own destruction. The fire reveals the building's vulnerability to threats that its designers never considered. The stone walls that resist cannon fire prove useless against flames that don't need to penetrate walls. They simply burn everything inside the walls, everything organic, everything combustible, everything that makes the stone structure into livable space rather than empty monument. Forensic disaster detail emerges as firefighting efforts reveal the building's limitations under emergency conditions. Water supply that's adequate for normal household uses proves inadequate for fighting fires that span multiple rooms across several floors. The height that water must be pumped to reach upper levels where fires burn most intensely exceeds the capacity of available technology. Physics defeats engineering when gravity works against firefighters who need to move water upward faster than fires can spread downward. Technology loses to physics in real time as firefighters discover that their equipment was designed for fighting fires in normal buildings rather than medieval fortresses. Hose lengths that work for urban fires prove insufficient for castle distances. Water pressure that works at ground level proves inadequate at tower heights. Ladder heights that work for civilian buildings prove useless for military architecture designed to be difficult to climb. The cause reads like noir fiction but operates through mundane criminality. Later investigations suggest arson by an underbutler who hoped to conceal evidence of theft. Fire as cover-up rather than accident. Destruction intended to eliminate evidence of smaller crimes that might have been discovered through normal inventory procedures. The castle burns not because of grand political conspiracy, but because of petty employee theft that escalated beyond control. The noir element reveals itself in the contrast between the massive destruction and the trivial motivation. A building that survived siege warfare, political revolution, centuries of changing ownership, gets gutted by domestic crime that spiraled out of control. The castle's monumental history becomes vulnerable to mundane corruption. Institutional permanence proves fragile when threatened by individual dishonesty. Fire doesn't erase Warwick, it rebrands it. The destruction creates opportunity for reconstruction according to contemporary standards, rather than historical accuracy. The fire becomes excuse for modernization, for improvements that would have been difficult to justify without catastrophic necessity, for changes that convert the castle from historical artifact into contemporary residence that happens to be housed in historical architecture. The rebuild will decide what gets remembered and what gets sold. Reconstruction choices determine which aspects of the castle's history become permanent and which become opportunities for revision. Fire damage becomes pretext for historical editing on architectural scale. The builders can preserve what they want to preserve and replace what they want to replace while claiming that fire damage, rather than ideological preference, determines what survives. Restoration under Anthony Salvin begins in 1872 and continues through 1875, subsidized by public donations totaling $9,651. A crowd-funded resurrection of aristocratic heritage that requires common citizens to pay for restoring symbols of elite power. The public financing reveals how cultural heritage operates as shared responsibility even when the heritage being preserved represents historical oppression of the people being asked to pay for its preservation. The moral accounting becomes complex and uncomfortable. Citizens contribute money to finance the repair of a symbol that once caged citizens. The castle's restoration becomes a community project that requires community members to support the preservation of architecture designed to control community members. The public pays to maintain buildings that were built to contain the public. The donation campaign succeeds because it frames the castle as cultural heritage rather than political history, as architectural treasure rather than institutional nightmare, as symbol of English achievement rather than symbol of English oppression. The fundraising narrative focuses on artistic value, historical significance, cultural importance while avoiding discussion of what the building actually did to actual people during its operational period. The dungeon remains operational while the bill goes public. The fundraising pays for restoring the parts of the castle that tourists want to see while preserving the parts that tourists aren't supposed to see. The donations support architectural heritage that includes both the symbols of power and the infrastructure of power, both the performance spaces and the containment spaces, both the public face and the private function. Historic England's official description compresses the trauma into a single sentence: fire damaged it, Salveen restored it. The institutional summary eliminates complexity, ambiguity, moral questions that might complicate simple narratives about architectural preservation and cultural heritage. The official record treats fire damage and restoration as technical problems rather than opportunities for historical reflection. The compression reveals how institutions prefer to handle historical complexity: through radical simplification that converts moral questions into administrative statements, that treats human suffering as background detail in stories about building maintenance, that focuses on structural preservation while ignoring functional preservation. The restoration preserves the architecture while editing the history. Once a castle becomes expensive to maintain through traditional aristocratic resources, it starts looking less like a family home and more like an asset waiting for a buyer. The ongoing costs of preservation exceed the financial capacity of individual owners who inherited wealth rather than earning it, who possess cultural capital rather than liquid capital, who own symbols of power rather than sources of power. Maintenance costs reveal themselves as more expensive than original construction because restoration requires specialized expertise, rare materials, techniques that are no longer widely practiced. Every repair becomes custom work. Every replacement becomes historical research. Every improvement becomes archaeological negotiation between preservation requirements and functional necessity. The castle becomes financially sustainable only through commercialization that converts private residence into public attraction, family heritage into tourist destination, historical symbol into economic enterprise. The transition requires new kinds of expertise: marketing rather than military strategy, customer service rather than containment operations, entertainment rather than intimidation. 1978 marks the corporate turn when Warwick Castle is sold to the Tussauds Group for $1.3 million according to some accounts, $1.5 million according to others. The variation in reported sale price reveals how history turns into a negotiable number when it becomes commercial property rather than cultural heritage, when market value becomes more important than historical value, when the castle's worth gets calculated according to revenue potential rather than cultural significance. The price discrepancy suggests that the castle's value depends on how you measure it, what you plan to do with it, what kind of return on investment you expect from owning a medieval fortress in the modern entertainment economy. The difference between Waterser 3 million and Waterser's 5 million represents uncertainty about whether you're buying a building or buying a business, whether you're purchasing real estate or purchasing opportunity. The sale transfers ownership from aristocratic family to entertainment corporation, from people who inherited the castle to people who purchased the castle, from owners who lived in the building to operators who profit from the building. The transaction converts family seat into corporate asset, historical residence into commercial property, cultural heritage into entertainment product. Modern ownership structures become increasingly complex as corporate restructures and lease agreements keep the castle open to the public while making its financial structure increasingly abstract. Merlin Entertainments operates the site under arrangements that separate ownership from operation, that allow multiple parties to profit from tourism without requiring any party to take full responsibility for historical accuracy or cultural preservation. The corporate structures create distance between decision-makers and consequences, between profit centers and cultural responsibilities, between entertainment objectives and educational obligations. The castle becomes product in a portfolio rather than place with specific history, asset to be optimized rather than heritage to be preserved, revenue stream to be maximized rather than cultural resource to be protected. If the castle is now entertainment rather than residence, what happens to the dungeon? The answer reveals the final transformation. It stops being hidden and becomes a product. The spaces that once required secrecy for political reasons now require visibility for commercial reasons. The dungeons that once operated through concealment now operate through advertisement. The transformation of the dungeon from hidden facility to featured attraction represents the completion of the castle's evolution from functional architecture to symbolic architecture, from operational system to historical display, from active containment to passive entertainment. The dungeon becomes safe to visit because it's no longer dangerous to inhabit. The modern castle dungeon attraction sells sensory history through carefully designed experience that allows tourists to see, hear, feel, and smell what imprisonment might have been like without experiencing what imprisonment actually was. The attraction is officially framed as not for the faint-hearted, which serves as both warning and advertisement, both disclaimer and marketing strategy. The sensory approach creates controlled simulation of historical experience that provides just enough authenticity to feel educational and just enough safety to feel entertaining. Tourists experience fear without danger, suffer without suffering, understand imprisonment without being imprisoned. The simulation creates knowledge without consequence, awareness without responsibility, memory without trauma. The attraction succeeds because it provides vicarious experience of historical suffering that leaves tourists feeling educated rather than traumatized, entertained rather than horrified, satisfied rather than disturbed. The dungeons become theme park rather than crime scene, historical recreation rather than historical location, performance rather than reality. But restoration costs reveal the ongoing expense of maintaining historical architecture for commercial purposes. Since 1978, major masonry and roofing projects reportedly exceed $25 million, more than 15 times the original purchase price. The castle survives by monetizing its own maintenance, by generating revenue sufficient to fund preservation, by making historical buildings pay for their own persistence through tourist dollars that support restoration work. The economic model creates dependence on continued tourism that requires continued entertainment value, that requires continued revision of historical presentation to meet changing tourist expectations. The castle must remain interesting enough to attract visitors while remaining comfortable enough to avoid driving visitors away. The balance requires constant adjustment of how much truth tourists can handle. The final systemic horror reveals itself through the transformation of function rather than elimination of function. The oubliettes' original purpose was to make someone disappear from public awareness while keeping them alive for administrative convenience. The modern purpose is to make that disappearance into a ticketed experience that tourists pay to observe, understand, and remember as educational entertainment. The horror isn't that the function changed. The horror is that the function didn't change as much as it appears to have changed. The oubliette still makes people disappear, but now the disappearance is voluntary, temporary, recreational rather than permanent, involuntary, punitive. The mechanism operates according to similar principles but serves different objectives. The original oubliette isolated prisoners from society while keeping them available for future use. The modern oubliette isolates tourists from normal reality while keeping them available for future purchases. The original system processed political enemies into containment. The modern system processes paying customers into entertainment. The architecture remains the same. The function remains recognizably similar, only the clientele has changed. We end on the trapdoor again because Warwick's haunting isn't paranormal. It's the sound of a system realizing it can never fully bury what it built. The trapdoor still opens. The space below still exists. The capacity for containment still functions. The only difference is that opening the trapdoor has become voluntary rather than involuntary, temporary rather than permanent, profitable rather than punitive. The trapdoor reveals the building's fundamental nature. It was built to contain people, and it still contains people. The people change. Prisoners become tourists, but the containment continues. The castle still processes human beings through controlled space according to systematic procedures that limit movement, monitor behavior, determine when people can enter and when people must leave. The sound that haunts Warwick isn't ghostly voices or supernatural phenomena. It's the sound of mechanisms that were designed for imprisonment continuing to function for entertainment. It's the sound of systems that learn to process human beings, discovering that the processing can continue indefinitely as long as the human beings consent to be processed and pay for the privilege. The haunting is institutional rather than paranormal. The castle is haunted by its own efficiency, by its own persistence, by its own ability to adapt to changing circumstances without changing its essential function. The building was designed to control people, and it still controls people. The methods have been refined. The objectives have been updated. The clientele has been improved. But the control continues. The trapdoor still opens when someone wants it to open. The space below still receives people who enter it voluntarily instead of involuntarily, temporarily instead of permanently, recreationally instead of punitively. But the space below still isolates those people from the world above, still contains them according to architectural logic that limits their options, still processes them according to systematic procedures that determine their experience. The castle's haunting is the sound of a machine that was built to last, discovering that it has lasted, that it continues to function, that it can adapt to serve new purposes without abandoning its original capabilities. The dungeons still work. The security systems still operate. The capacity for containment still exists, waiting patiently for circumstances that might require it to resume its original function. The trapdoor closes behind the last tourist of the day. The castle settles into nighttime quiet that sounds like all the other nighttime quiet it has experienced across 9 centuries of operation. The silence is patient, expectant, ready. The building waits for tomorrow's tourists, next season's visitors, future customers who will pay to experience what the castle can provide. But the building also waits for other possibilities. Political instability that might require containment facilities. Economic crisis that might make tourism unprofitable. Social unrest that might make entertainment inappropriate. The castle is ready for any future that needs its services, in whatever form those services might take. The castle has learned to be patient, to adapt, to survive by serving whoever needs what it can provide. It has served Norman conquerors and English kings and parliamentary forces and royal armies and aristocratic families and entertainment corporations. It will serve whoever comes next, whoever needs what it offers, whoever understands that some functions are too useful to abandon completely. The trapdoor waits. The dungeon endures. The machine rests, but does not sleep. And Warwick Castle continues its long career as a building that understands its purpose, that remembers its function, that preserves its capacity for service to anyone who needs what it has always provided. The ability to make people disappear from one kind of life and reappear in another kind of life, whether that disappearance is punishment or entertainment, whether that reappearance is release or education. The haunting continues not because the castle can't escape its past, but because its past was built to last, built to endure, built to remain functional across centuries of changing political circumstances and social conditions. The castle isn't haunted by ghosts. It's haunted by its own competence, its own durability, its own persistent readiness to resume operations whenever operations become necessary. The trapdoor closes, the castle waits, the system endures, and somewhere in the thickness of 3-meter walls, in the dampness of spaces that learn to sweat, in the silence of chambers designed to absorb sound, Warwick Castle continues its quiet, patient, efficient work of being exactly what it was built to be, a machine for processing human beings according to the requirements of whoever controls the machine. The tourists leave, the lights dim, the castle returns to its essential self, and the haunting continues, not supernatural, but systemic, not paranormal, but perfectly normal for a building that was designed to outlast the people who built it, to serve whoever inherits it, to remain functional until the stones themselves forget how to hold together. The machine waits, the memorial rests, the monument endures. And the castle proves that some things are built too well to ever really stop working, built too efficiently to ever really be reformed, built too permanently to ever really be retired. Warwick Castle. A building that learned to survive by learning to serve, that preserved itself by preserving its function, that remains haunted not by its victims, but by its own inexhaustible capacity to create new victims whenever circumstances require new victims to be created. The trapdoor closes. The system rests. the haunting continues.